finally, just for you, Brad, we're actually going to talk about people tonight. That's pretty awesome, right? No hamsters, no rats. We're not going to talk about crayfish or monkeys. I know it's taken us like 5 months to get here, but Meredith, we finally get to talk about people, okay? So that's exciting, right? And how many of you are interested in children? Yeah, okay. Go up to the 4th floor, they'll talk to you about that problem. All jokes aside, you should visit the 4th floor if you are, right? Because it's like free. Have I mentioned that? It's like free counseling. That's like money you can put in your pocket. Not really, because we don't pay you to go up there. But if you're thinking like, boy, why not? You should. 4th floor. They're even there in the summer. I don't know if that's true.
I know the ones in Pritchard are in the summer.
Yeah, Pritchard. They handle different things in Pritchard. But you can always just go up there and like make an appointment. And how many of you don't answer this? Because this is like private information, right, Katie? Like, how many of you are like, man, I don't know what I'm going to do with my life? They'll help you up there. Or like, hey, tests really make me nervous. They'll help you up there. Or other things like, geez, clowns make me wet my pants. They'll help you up there. Does that work? All kinds of things. I thought more people would laugh at that, but I guess more of you have problems with clowns than I'd anticipated.
Which is fun, Frankie.
Seriously, it's very hot in here. All right, so we should talk about, and we're not going to get away from brains, sorry, but we are going to talk about brains and people. I mean, they're almost people. They're those like special kind of people that are short and snotty, known as kids. And sometimes they're aggressive. So that's exciting. I mean, because non-aggressive kids aren't fun to watch. I mean, not watch like be responsible for, but just like sit back and eat some popcorn and watch. It's much right, Dina? All right. So we should talk about models of childhood aggression, right? And there are sort of two broad approaches to explaining why kids are aggressive. Okay? Two models at least, Bree, in terms of brain models, right? And we'll talk a little bit about some other sort of approaches later, but in terms of your brain, there are two approaches to explain why kids may have aggression. These models could really be applied to adults, right? I mean, they're not necessarily limited to children, but there are some special things we want to think about when we're talking about kids. The first model is what we call the frontal lobe dysfunction hypothesis. Okay? How many of you know you have a frontal cortex? Great. How many of you use that frontal cortex? This is about what I thought. So the frontal lobe is very important, right? It's really what makes you different than a rat. Okay? So it would be really hard, Brad, to say like the frontal lobe dysfunction hypothesis for rat aggressive behavior, right? Because they don't really have a frontal lobe. There's not really anything up there. But in humans, we can use this model, and we can use this hypothesis to explain why kids, in this case, but other folks might be aggressive. So, frontal lobe, how do we know that maybe frontal lobe is involved in aggression? There are many approaches. One approach is for folks who have damage to their frontal lobes, right? And you can get your frontal lobe damaged in a lot of ways. How many of you are familiar with Phineas Gage? We've probably talked about him in this class, right? He had that frontal lobe blowout kind of thing. That guy had some weird behavior, would sometimes be aggressive, right? That was an issue that he had after his accident. Other folks who have damage to their frontal lobes, they tend to exhibit a higher rate of aggressive behavior than folks who don't have damage to their frontal lobes. So that's one thing. But other approaches are neuroimaging, for example. So if you stick someone in an fMRI machine and you just have them kind of sit there, it's okay, Meredith, we'll make it. I promise. I've got an ice cream truck coming later. No, I'm just kidding. It's not happening. So, folks who are aggressive, so you want to have like two groups here, right? You've got to have a control group, that's your regular people, And then you want to have your aggressive kids or aggressive adults as well. Stick these folks in an fMRI machine. Don't have them do anything. We don't want them doing anything. We just want them to sit there. They're just going to sit. They're going to kind of relax. What you see is that folks who have a higher lifetime history of aggression actually have reduced activity in their frontal lobes. So that's kind of interesting, right? So it's not just like you're going to destroy your frontal lobe and then you're going to become aggressive, but if your frontal lobe is not functioning, like even when you're just sitting there, right? You're just sitting there, you're not doing anything, your frontal lobe is not going to be active, more than likely you're a person who's more aggressive. Now the problem with this sort of model is a few things. One, there are different kinds of aggression. We're going to talk about those in just a moment. That's really going to be the bulk of the lecture, these different kinds of aggression, right? And how different brain regions contribute to sort of these two broad categories of aggressive behavior in humans. Up until now, we've really talked about aggression in terms of really only sort of one broad category. We've talked about offensive and defensive aggression, but it's all been sort of in response to something else, right? And we'll talk about that more in just a moment. But one of the problems with the frontal lobe dysfunction is the frontal cortex has a lot of parts, right? It's not just like frontal cortex. You've got orbital frontal cortex, you have dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. You've got all of these different brain regions. These folks haven't done such a great job parsing out the role of each bit of frontal cortex. Part of the problem there is each bit's kind of small, right? And it's really difficult to like hold still, I'm going to hit you in the head, but only enough to knock out one part of frontal cortex, but definitely on both sides at the same time. Seems difficult, right, Brooks? You're not going to be able to do that. So it's kind of tricky. The other problem is, how many of you have heard of ADHD? Yeah, they're like kids with this, right? They're the really annoying ones. No, just joking. They're all equally annoying. So adults have ADHD too. Most adults are a little better at dealing with those problems, right? With the difficulties that they have related to this. Kids, not so much. But what's interesting about this, one thing that we do know about people with ADHD is, guess what's not working? Their frontal cortex, right, Lauren? So their frontal cortex is not saying to them like, hey, it's probably a bad idea for you to like stand up and kind of jump around in the middle of class. You should probably just sit there like everybody else. Or like, hey, that shiny thing can wait for a moment, you know, like keep doing what you're doing and don't give up on that. Frontal cortex is involved in a lot of those things, right? And that makes sense. And so if your frontal cortex isn't working, you can have some symptoms of ADHD or actual problems. Kids with ADHD also tend to be a little more aggressive as well, right? And then that's not something that's probably a surprise to you. If you are more active, it's more likely that you're going to be more aggressive, right? Just because if you're doing more things, randomly some of those are going to be aggressive, right, Elena? I mean, it's not, you know, a problem necessarily that's, you know, all people with ADHD are these like super aggressive people and just run around and punch people in the face. Lily?
Does that include both types of ADHD, the inattentive type and hyperactive?
Jeez, I don't know. They don't know. That's another problem. They don't know. And ADHD is a huge confound on this whole thing, right? Like, your frontal cortex isn't working, you're going to be impulsive, right? You're going to do some things that you shouldn't do. Some of those things you shouldn't do are going to be aggressive, right? That's going to happen. But that doesn't, I mean, how does that relate to this frontal lobe dysfunction hypothesis and this ADHD problem that kind of confounds that and just creates a real problem, right?
That's interesting though. Like to get the result of that would be interesting because girls hide their ADHD better than boys do. So I don't know.
And then you run into other, and so this is like a whole other like sex difference issue as well, right? Males tend to be more physically aggressive.
Yes.
Females, and we're not even going to get into this at the moment, they tend to be passive aggressive, right? And then even adults, right? And this is like even looking at kids versus adults. Like adults are less likely to be physically aggressive, but they might have other forms of aggression, right? That you can switch over to verbal, be verbally aggressive, right? And there are all of these other wrinkles on top of that. That's why for like the first 10 weeks of class we had to talk about animals and crustaceans, which are not verbally aggressive. Yeah. They're urinarily aggressive occasionally, but not verbally. I made that word up, urinarily. I don't even know if
It should be a real word.
it should. Horrifically, I don't know if that helps. Try using it in Scrabble. So Abigail, problems and wrinkles, right? And so we don't really know. The other sort of idea about aggression is related to the fear dysfunction hypothesis. Okay? And this hypothesis says there's something screwed up with your fear circuits, and that causes you to be more aggressive. And of course that makes some sense, right? I mean, if you are afraid of something, if you're in a fearful situation, your autonomic nervous system is going to be amped up, right, Katie? And the likelihood that you do, that's why we call it fight or flight, right? One of the two, okay? And if you're constantly on edge, the likelihood that you're going to be in that fight or flight, okay, so you're not always going to run, sometimes you're going to fight, right? You're going to be aggressive, so that's going to increase your rate of aggressive acts, right? If you're constantly afraid of things and constantly have that fear dysfunction. We run into some similar problems here. The description of fear dysfunction it has been vague, right? The way folks have tried to conceptualize this hypothesis, it's been sort of vague. There are also, as we'll talk in a few minutes, sort of some conflicting ideas about the role of the amygdala in this whole process, right? And the folks who have defined fear dysfunction hypothesis have not really defined which way the amygdala moves on this, right? Is it overactive, underactive? What's the problem? And so that, in and of itself, creates some issues. Overall, there are problems with both of these hypotheses. I myself am not a very theory-driven individual. I know that's sort of counter to, Katie wrote that down for some reason. I don't know why he did. But in general, I'm not a very theory-driven individual. Most of the field of psychology is very theory-driven, right, Brad? I think you would say that. Everybody kind of has these theoretical camps, and then they fight each other over things, right? And I think that's stupid and a waste of time. And I'll be honest with you, that's why people make fun of psychologists, right? And I know I've said that, right, Dina? That's why people don't make fun of chemists. Do you know why? Because it's chemistry. And there are not people in these there are people in different camps, but they're all looking at data and experiments and all working toward the same thing, right? They're not really fighting each other. They do sometimes. It's really fun when chemists fight. But it's not the same sort of arguments, right? There aren't these like fundamental ideas that are different in chemistry, right? There's not somebody going out there and saying like carbon, no, definitely only makes 3 bonds. Not going to make 4. Okay, I'm a 3-bond carbonite, not a 4-bonder. We don't have that in chemistry, right? And this is not. For those of you that want to know, carbon is really awesome. It combined to like 4 things, which is sort of unique, right? That's why we're all carbon-based life forms. That's why like science fiction people are always like, oh, the next one's going to be silicon-based. If you look at the periodic table, silicon's the next one down, right, in that column, so it can also do like 4 bonds, right? So just as a little side note there, I know you guys are really excited about that. So, don't have those sort of fundamental arguments. They did very early on, right, in chemistry. And there's a great book out there by Thomas Kuhn, and it's the The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. It's a little dry. Have you read it?
No, I'm just imagining.
Yeah, it's a little dry. It's actually, it's not bad. A lot of it, Dina, just in case you're curious, walks you through the history of chemistry and largely the history of the discovery of oxygen, right? Because prior to, those can lights are the ones that create the most heat, not really the fluorescent lights, in case you want to know that, right? So it's definitely going to cool down now that I turned those off. Just, Brandon, I promise. Just tell yourself, I can already feel it's cooler up here. So it walks you through the history of this sort of like fight about like what is oxygen, how does oxygen work, and whatever, right? But in psychology, we're very much still having that argument, right? I mean, that's why we have people in these broad disciplines that are conflicting, right? And they don't really match together. And I think that's one problem with both of these approaches. is they create these theories. They don't really, like some guy was like sitting around with a pint of Guinness, which is where all great ideas start, and he said, wow, it must be your like fear dysfunction. Who cares about the rest? And then some other guy was like, well, it's got to be the frontal lobe screwed up. I don't know. And then they just, you know, didn't really design great experiments, and the experiments they had designed have given them information, but they've not worked to kind of bring these two together, right? So I think you have to do that. So that's a big problem. The other problem is with both the frontal lobe and the amygdala. Both of these are actually composed of smaller bits, right? I mean, we talked about the amygdala and we talked about the various structures in the amygdala, right? And there are 3 to 5 sort of nuclei in that amygdaloid complex, right? And so maybe one of them is excited and one isn't, and they can go in opposite directions. Different things can happen, you get different outcomes. Same thing with the frontal lobe. So both of these hypotheses, they get you somewhere, but I don't know really if they get you all the way to like figuring things out. The second thing to kind of take away from this that I think is like a if you're going to synthesize both of these together, right? It's okay, if we're going to put this together, what we want to think about is aggression, is it really one thing, right? Is it only one thing, or is it maybe multiple things, right? And do those multiple things have different brain circuits that control them, right? I think that's probably a better way to think about this. So we'll just, and then put it all into one, we'll call it GA, general aggression hypothesis. I don't know. You make it up, call it whatever. Aggression is very important, right? And things that are very important typically have sort of backup circuits, and they have multiple circuits to control, even though it looks like the same behavior. Punching someone in the face, while you might define that as the aggressive act, is really only the outcome of a series of calculations, right? And I think that's what's more important. And AJ, we talked about sort of at the beginning of the semester how so much of the focus of aggression and aggressive literature studies on this have been focused only on the fight, right? And the lead up to that is really the interesting story, right? Who cares if two people punch each other? We know what's going to happen. Someone's going to bleed and fall down, right? That's how that works. But what's really interesting is the lead up to that. Like, why did you do this? You know, what were the conditions that led you to that particular behavior? I think that's, and as we focus more on that, we'll get better ideas about what aggression does and why we have aggressive behavior. So, very likely, we're dealing with sort of 2 different neural circuits, at least 2 different neural circuits, right? Maybe more than that, right? Maybe kind of branches along the way in a lot of places, okay? Any questions about this? Make sure you write down everything that I did exactly, just like this. That'll help you understand the notes. All right. Previously, we've talked about types of aggression in terms of sort of defense, offense. We talked about maternal aggression. We talked about territorial defense. We've talked about a variety of these sort of approaches. I would like today to think about aggression in sort of 2 different terms, right? And kind of break this apart. And what I want to think about today are what we call reactive aggression and instrumental aggression. Okay. These may end up in the same exact behavior, and again, that behavior could simply be punching someone in the face. I don't know if you've ever done that. You don't have to answer. You've at least seen someone or thought about someone punching someone else in the face, right? And if we think about that, you could create a whole lot of stories. If I said, everybody, we're going to go over to the, you know, I don't know, creative fiction class. I assume they offer that. And Kate, we're going to write a story, and the end result, the last sentence in your story is going to be character A, you can name character A whatever you want, punches character B in the face. That's the last sentence of your story. The rest of it you can make up on your own, whatever that is, right? And you could make up a whole lot of stories there, right? That could end in that particular sentence. You guys go home and do that for homework if you want.
You get extra credit.
But you'll get extra practice writing, which most of you need. So there you go. It's not going to help you in this class, 'cause it's going to be creative writing, but I think you still have to use grammar, so that might be useful. I don't know if you guys have ever used grammar. It's underrated, but highly valuable. So pull it out once in a while. You guys ever, I have this great book. It's like the only book I ever kept from my undergraduate years, because probably the only one I bothered to buy. And I only bothered to buy it because like someone wouldn't let me like look over their shoulder and use their book. I was a very unengaged undergraduate student, which I would not recommend. So I try to fight against that, because I see like maybe in one of you potential to do something, and I'm not sure which one it is. So I have to unfortunately try to encourage all of you, even though I know that's like wasting my time with like 30 of you. But all the same, Johnny, that's what we're going to do. I bought this great book, and it was like a handbook on writing. And so what I could do is I could like open it, which is what you do with books, and I could look down and it would say like, here's how to use a comma. I was like, oh, I need a comma there. Or like, here's when I need a semicolon. Or, I mean, some of you don't even know a semicolon exists, but there it is, Chelsea. I'm just like throwing it out. And I could look in there, and it was very helpful. It's like, oh, when should I capitalize this or not? Or should I use parentheses? What, you know, all of these great things. And it's like this thick, which I know is like thicker than most things you read, but it was very helpful. It's like the Allen and Bacon Writer's Handbook or something. I don't know. If you have something similar, you should use it. You have one, Brad?
There's one called like AP Style. It's good.
Yeah, this is a little more than style. I mean, style guides are great, and you should use those as well. But this is important. Like, do you know whether or not you should spell out a number or write it in digits?
Yes.
You know that?
Yes.
Oh, okay. See, I don't. So that's why I look it up in the book. So I know when I should. That's important, right?
I think a lot of us got taught that in like middle and high school.
Yeah. And back then you should have been taught things like how to tie your shoes, because you weren't ready for that, and I know this. It's like a waste of time. Nobody asked me though. So there you go. And then you didn't do anything with it for a long time, right? Somebody yelled at you, and it was probably like an elderly woman about like, you know, perfect future tense or something, and you're like, I don't even know what that is. And then you never used it again. And then you just went back to like emoji people. That's the problem. All right. Different types of aggression. Reactive aggression. Sometimes called effective, and that's affective, right? Not effective. Effective aggression is something different than affective aggression. That's sort of related to emotional. You know, we usually think about aggression as an emotional act, right? And I don't want to necessarily say that it isn't, but when we get down to instrumental aggression here in a few moments, only probably like an hour and a half from now, so you guys have that to look forward to. When we get down to that, Elena, we'll talk about maybe some other things, right? But reactive aggression is typically what we think of when we're threatened, right? So if there's a threat and you respond to that threat, that's reactive, right? That makes sense. There's some interest in thinking about prior threats, right? And how prior threats will sensitize you to responding to current threats, right? How many of you remember when we talked about fear conditioning, right? That's very much a prior threat, sensitizing that animal to those prior threats, and then guess what happens? They respond, often inappropriately, vigorously to some stimulus, right? And so they're going to be more responsive to that. You all probably know someone who exhibits reactive aggression, right? And they will blame that on prior threats, right? Because I'm sure you've heard someone say, oh, well, I did that because everybody's trying to, whatever. You can't let people cut in front of you in line because they're all trying to take your coffee, right? And that's because like one time someone cut in front of them and then they ran out of the like special foamy mocha or whatever people drink, and then they got really upset about that.
So you were saying it can be used as a justification.
Yeah, well, people do use it as a justification. I don't know that it's a valid justification, but they do use it, right? I mean, if you can think about folks who, and here's probably a valid situation. Think about someone who has PTSD, for example, right? And they're going to have some sort of a response, and that response can occasionally be aggressive, right, to a threat or a perceived threat. And I think, that individual could say, hey, I responded in that way because of this prior experience that I had, right? And I think in that case, that's probably a valid justification. Doesn't necessarily mean that there shouldn't be some intervention there, right? But that is a valid, sort of instance. And speaking of folks with PTSD, it kind of segues into the second sort of point. Reactive aggression is associated with an overactive amygdala, right? And if that's the guy who's making threat assessments, that's the guy who's saying you should have an emotional response to this, then it makes perfect sense, right? That is the particular brain region that's going to be overactive in people who exhibit a higher level of reactive aggression. I'm wondering, what the temperature is in the president's house right now.
Probably better than here.
Somebody should tweet him that. He's a tweeter fan. Tweeter. No, he's always on Twitter, right? You guys follow him on Twitter? No. No. Afraid he's gonna follow you back and know what you do with your life.
I got better things to do with my time.
But I don't know. I see these things where, and he takes his own selfies. You can tell because he's always half out of it. So that's not a professional helping him.
I mean, it's better than seeing the whole thing passed out.
You can comment on that how you like. But I bet this house is really cold right now. You think they'd let us move class over? Yeah, try that. Send them a twerk and see what happens. Shorter, I don't know, a Twitter message. What's a private message on Twitter? Direct message. You should. That's a good word, right? All right. So overactive amygdala. If you've got one of those, you're probably going to have reactive aggression. Not a big deal. Hey, but remember that frontal lobe thing? Possibly you've got a problem with your frontal lobes too, right? If you have reactive aggression, because your frontal lobes are not telling you, Brooke, don't punch that guy, right? Instead, you're just going to punch him. In particular, there is an area of the brain called Brodmann's area 47. That's why I put BA there. That's not a bachelor's degree, right? I got a bachelor's of art in 1947. It's Brodmann's area, and that's Brodmann's with only one A and two N's. Okay. So the first A that you might think is in there is not, and then there's an extra N at the end just instead. So that's the lateral orbital frontal cortex. Remember that time I told you, frontal cortex is made up of a bunch of places, and there are a bunch of small places. One of those is Brodmann's area 47. And that one tends to be involved in reactive aggression specifically. So individuals with sort of damaged or inactive Brodmann's area 47, they're going to have more reactive aggression. Oh, yeah, and serotonin. That's involved too, just in case you were curious. I know we've never talked about that in this class. But folks with reduced serotonin, they're more aggressive, and they have more reactive aggression. It seems in particular to affect reactive aggression, right, Abigail? So of the other two kinds of aggression we're going to deal with, particularly reactive aggression. And you can do this because I know I promised you we're not going to talk about non-humans today, but there are mice, knockout mice, that are missing genes, of course, for serotonin production and so forth. Those mice tend to have higher levels of reactive aggression. So you all right, Brad? Yeah. It's unpleasant in here, isn't it?
Yeah.
Was it having a smaller VA-47 or having like more activity or less activity?
It's going to be less activity. Higher activity in BA-47, Brahms area 47, that would sort of reduce your reactive, right? Because anytime for the most part, anytime your frontal cortex is more active, you're going to be less impulsive. You're going to actually think things through. This is why they give folks, like going back to this idea of ADHD, this is why they give folks with ADHD stimulants, right? You kind of think, well, that's just ridiculous. This person's already like, why should I give them a stimulant? And then there are these people who have the wrong idea about why they do it. And they think, well, if you like give them an extra stimulant, it'll make them tired. Well, that's not exactly what happened. Actually, that's not what happens at all. In fact, what it does is it just activates their frontal cortex, which has been taking a nap for a while. So in fact, people with ADHD, they actually have less active frontal cortex. And so by stimulating activity in the frontal cortex, then you can go like, oh, maybe I shouldn't do that. I know I have something in my hand and I'd love to see how far I can throw it, but there's like a car over there I could hit too, so let's just wait. So you kind of cut down.
I have a question. Did you want a high five or?
Not really.
Okay. Well, I was just wondering, like, for people who have or are on ADHD medication,
Yeah.
one of the side effects is that they can be really tired all the time. Like my nephew, he would sleep like all day. Do you think that's
Yeah.
because of the too much stimulation or just a side effect of medication?
I'd have to think about what kind of medication. There are different kinds of ADHD medication, right? And so that makes a difference. They could be altering other neurotransmitter levels. That could be affecting things. Sometimes you will, folks will take like an SNRI.
Yeah.
And sometimes in combo with an SSRI, which that's actually a non-stimulant ADHD medication. So yeah, that would.
It would take more figuring out.
Yeah. All right. Any questions about reactive? All right. Let's talk about instrumental aggression for a while. Would you like that tornado I drew?
Yeah.
Instrumental aggression. This is different. This is different in the fact that this type of aggression is sort of goal-directed, right? This is applied to a particular situation to change that situation in a direction that is, I don't really want to use the word positive here.
Beneficial?
Yeah, beneficial to the actor, to the person doing the aggressive thing, right? So, again, punching someone in the face could be reactive because they may have just called you a name, or punching someone in the face may be instrumental because it knocks them out of the way for you to go get a resource of some sort, right? If you're trying to get access to bread. I don't know, I'm thinking about bread lines for some reason right now, right? So if you're in line for food and there are rations, and you can sort of like take the person in front of you and chuck them over the ravine, well, that seems like a reasonable thing to do to make sure you get food for you and your family, right?
Well, I mean, I think that's
Yeah.
debatable.
Well, no, it's not. Because I live by this rule. I don't trust people if they're hungry. I only trust people for like as long as lunch lasts. Because hungry people will kill you. Right?
Yeah.
And justifiably so, right? I have like random acts of violence. Like I don't understand that. I don't understand. Like those bother me. I'm like, oh, jeez. But if somebody mugs me and tries to take my wallet, I'm like that's just resource acquisition, and that makes perfect sense to me, right? That person is simply trying to get resources to, supply their life, and I'm like, well, that makes sense. I'm doing the same thing. I mean, I'm not like out there mugging people, but I'm trying to get resources to fund my lifestyle, right? And so I'm thinking, well, they decided to do it in a different way, maybe not the way I would do it, maybe not the way our society says to do it, but it's still instrumental, right? It's still instrumental aggression. It's goal directed. It's for some beneficial outcome, and it's to move that person sort of closer to whatever goal they have, right? Whether that's acquiring food or mates or funding to get either of those, whatever it is that's going on, right? So instrumental aggression, normal, perfectly fine, we've all done this. Right? Nobody's going to admit to it. Everybody's saying like, nope, never done that. You've never sort of cut in front of someone in line. That's instrumental aggression, right? So you don't think of that as an aggressive act, but it is. What's interesting about this is there's a group of people called adolescent limited antisocial actors, I believe is the word they used. But adolescent limited antisocial behavior. This is sort of a way you can differentiate folks that are in this reactive group. They're going to exhibit like sustained or continued antisocial behavior. And all we mean by antisocial in this case, we're not really going into really deep definitions. We're simply thinking about, inappropriate aggressive acts directed at other individuals. That's very antisocial, right? Not the best way to make friends, going around kicking people. I guess it depends on who you kick, right? So, in fact, there are some folks who define adolescence, that time period, as a time of, like you have to break a rule, right? I mean, there's no way you can go through adolescence and not.
To test boundaries.
Absolutely, that's what they're doing, and
Yeah.
so that's sort of the idea. That time period is a time period of natural rule breaking, right? And because you want to know what are the boundaries, what are the consequences, and it might actually be impossible to go through that time period without breaking some rule. I mean that's sort of a hallmark definition there. So if you think like you've never broken a rule, you're probably still like a juvenile. You've not made it to adolescence and adulthood yet. You gotta break a few rules. I always like to say like the hallmark of adulthood is knowing which rules to follow and which rules you don't have to.
Yeah.
And you figure that out in adolescence, right? So there you go. Like going around breaking people's windows, that's a rule you have to follow. Like you shouldn't do that. The speed limit, that's one, right? Sometimes you don't have to follow that. It depends on who's looking. Please don't speed. I don't trust that any of you are that great at driving. Or that focused on your task. So, there are folks who are lifetime antisocial actors, right? So they're probably going to have some different sort of problems. There are also those who have limited adolescent antisocial behavior, right? And I think most folks fall into that. Some folks fall into this in a slightly more criminal and detrimental way, right? So there are a variety of reasons for that. But again, it's going to be limited. It is going to be toward goals, right? You're trying to maybe get somewhere. You're trying to get higher status, right? Quite often, kids will think, rule breakers are super cool, right? Like, check out that guy. I mean, I don't know, what are rules kids break? He runs in the hallway. That's exciting. I'm going to run in the hallway too.
Underage drinking.
Underage drinking, that's a big one, right?
Smoking.
Huh?
Smoking, kids
Yeah.
smoking.
Yeah, that's another one too. That's a good face, right? Even overage smoking, right? Kind of make that face. And then you'll always make that face because it's always wrinkly. So there you go, right? And that was, see how that worked? It was just perfect. I'm gonna get enough wrinkles like dealing with you folks. I don't want to add extra ones. So there you go, right? That's something to think about.
Wait, does that go into instrumental aggression, like the antisocial behavior?
Yeah, it does. Because it is, you're trying to increase your social status. That's very goal directed, right? It's not someone punched you and then you decide, well, I'm going to smoke. Doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, does it, Brad? I mean, does that really make any? That doesn't make any sense, does it? But doing things in other directions does sort of make sense. So that's that antisocial behavior. Now, most people think about this as like a cost calculation error. So folks, now this is not like we're not saying that all of you, again, because we've established this, have broken some rule, Katie. Okay? We're not saying like every single one of you have a deficient cost calculation system. Okay? At some point, your cost calculation system has failed you, right? Because I'm going to assume, like everybody else here, you've done something that wasn't the right thing to do at some time, right? It was you miscalculated the effect or the consequence of that particular behavior. Happens all the time, right? Okay. How many of you have ever miscalculated the cost of not having maintenance on your car? Yeah. And then you were on the side of the road with a tow truck, right? That happens. So, always get your oil changed, your tires rotated, other things. Yeah. If parts fall off of your car, you should try to get them put back on. I know that costs money, but think about those things. They put them on there for a reason typically. There aren't a whole lot of extra parts on your car. There are some you can do without. I was driving down the road once, Elena, and the drive shaft of a truck in front of me fell out. I know, right? So there's like this 6-foot long missile coming at me while I'm driving down the road. It was quite frightening. The truck didn't go very far. I just went around. Yeah. They stole that idea from me, from that instance right there. I just called the movie producer and said,
wow, what a great idea.
Cost calculation system is deficient. Folks who have a high level of instrumental aggression. If you think, hey, I can steal that car. That's instrumental, right? Oh, that's a nice car. I'd love to drive that, right? Bring them. Let's steal it. That's one way to get a nice car, right? But there are costs to that, like arrest, jail time. Those are things most people want to avoid. But if you're doing your calculation on this, you're like, well, the likelihood, Sydney, that I get arrested is pretty minimal, right? Nobody's going to notice, right? Who cares? Nobody is going to call in that their car is missing, right? So why would I ever get caught? I'll just drive this forever, right? It doesn't work that way. The amygdala is also involved in folks who have high levels of instrumental aggression, but in a different way. One sort of concept behind instrumental aggression is that individuals with high levels of instrumental aggression are unable to make sort of stimulus-response pairings, right? So they're unable to learn, I saw that blue light, I got shocked. I saw the blue light, I got shocked. When I see the blue light, guess what happens next? Oh, I don't know. Right? If your amygdala is not working, that's what you're going to, I don't know. The rest of us are going to go, you're probably going to get shocked. Okay? If you steal a car, you get arrested. If you steal a car, you get arrested, right? So they have difficulty with this stimulus response learning. They have difficulty associating punishments in particular with some behavior or some action that they take. So you can imagine if you were someone who had a problem learning, making those associations, you're going to exhibit more instrumental aggression. You're not necessarily going to have more reactive aggression, right? You're not necessarily going to, because it doesn't really matter. I mean, if someone attacks you, you're going to respond, right? And so that's not necessarily going to be affected here because you don't have any ability to learn stimulus response or learn about punishments or negative outcomes. So the amygdala, again, is going to be involved. It's going to be less active. It's not going to be functioning properly. Okay. Oh, also the frontal cortex is going to be involved here. Different parts of the frontal cortex. The difficulty is that folks with instrumental aggression, they have some difficulty with the extinction process, right? So that process doesn't work very well. They not only do they have difficulty sort of learning a stimulus response pairing, but they have difficulty sort of shifting the value, right? So if it's blue light, shock, and then blue light with no shock, they're going to have difficulty, if they have managed to learn blue light shock, they're going to have difficulty realizing that the blue light no longer predicts the shock. So once they are able to do something, they have some difficulty shifting that to another stimulus, which would be very troubling because once you've associated like one action with a negative outcome, it's going to be difficult to shift that to other, to shift that association to other actions. So there you go. That's instrumental aggression. Who's excited about that?
That's interesting.
Yeah, it was most interesting thing you've heard about aggression today. All right, we're on slide 3. We're flying through this, right? So, the conclusion is that kids are weird, and you shouldn't waste your time trying to understand them. No, those are not necessarily good conclusions, right? So what are we able to conclude from this? Definitely multiple brain circuits are involved for sort of global aggression, right? And really we should probably stop thinking about aggression as a cohesive concept, and really we should break it down to the different types of aggression, right? We've already talked about maternal aggression, specific brain circuits involved there. Today we talked about instrumental versus reactive aggression and different brain circuits involved, right? So there are multiple brain circuits that are involved in aggression, and this is why you might see individuals who exhibit one type of reaction, one type of aggression, but not another, right? Someone could be really high on reactive aggression, okay? If somebody accidentally bumps into you and then you start yelling at them, that's reactive aggression. That's an inappropriate reactive aggression. But you're not going to go out and steal a car because you're able to learn that stealing a car has negative consequences, right? And that you should be afraid, or at least you should understand that there are negative consequences. So because there are different brain circuits, you'll have different ways of exhibiting aggressive behaviors. Now this can be tricky, and this is why you need to, if you're ever going to be like watching someone's behavior, you need to start thinking about what kind of aggression is that. Was that just in response to someone else's action? Was this goal-directed aggression to try to, acquire some resources? Which can be very tricky. What if one child runs over and takes the toy from another child? That's probably not enough to really tell you, right? Because that could definitely be goal-directed. They want to play with that awesome toy, right? But it could also be reactive. What if that first child took it from, the other child first, and then they're just responding to that? So you have to kind of look at the whole concept and the whole situation to understand what's going on. Does that make sense? All right. Anybody have any questions about kids or aggression?
Well, I just do not understand why the extinction problem is more linked to instrumental aggression rather than to reactive aggression.
Yeah, so in the reactive aggression, we're not really concerned with, it's not really, you're not really concerned with learning any sort of association, right? Because you're really you're being threatened. That threat doesn't require a high level of learning, so you don't really have to spend time.
So it's just instinct.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's actually a good way to think about reactive aggression in general. Is it's more instinctual, right? It's of course if someone kicks you, you're going to respond aggressively to that. Except for a few times where we might talk about conditioned defeat or other sort of learned helplessness kind of things. But aside from that, yeah, we're thinking about something that's just sort of an automatic instinctual response, right? Something that's probably a bit hormonal and related to neurotransmitters, more so than the instrumental aggression, which is going to be, again, it's that goal-directed process, right? And so you're actually trying to acquire something. You're just not so great at thinking about the negative consequences of your plan to acquire those resources. Any other questions? All right, well, folks, despite the fact that I let you out early,